I'm just quite curious about this question of the image. I'm just curious, what is an image?
It kind of dissolves into a kind of surface that has a complexity that we can't really comprehend.
Or would you be interpreting in the same way if they were hung both vertically?
I think it does go into quite a profound philosophical rhetoric straight away.
It kind of reminds you that painting can show you infinity and kind of life and endlessness.
So I'm going to do that thing of welcoming everybody again. I'm Henry, it's Haminda, Josh and Carolina. And we're going to start with Carolina, who's going to talk a little bit about something she thinks is interesting and throw it open as a question.
So I wanted to talk about two things: materiality and process. Because obviously, my first response to these paintings is a visceral response. So that relates to materiality and the tactile surfaces of the paintings. So what I wanted to ask you is whether the image exists in these paintings. Is it there? And if it's there, how does it come into being? How does it emerge? And how does it function?
I'm just quite curious about this question of the image. And I'm just curious, what is an image? This is also selfishly, it's something I've been asking in my own work.
I think it's a really good question, and I'd like to hear what my colleagues think, but I'm going to ask a question back just in that. We have also in this space 3 things we would call sculptures. And are they images? I'm interested, because I think it's a interesting question around what is an image. Is this an image? Do we think? Is it an image?
It's not as...
I don't know. So my immediate feeling is this is not an image. I don't know. That's my immediate reaction. Is this is not an image. So I think it's, and maybe this is kind of treading over old ground. But there's something interesting about this thing is in the space. It occupies the same space I do. So it feels like it's not an image. But then am I kind of falling into the trap of saying these are images because they're on the wall? So are they? Is image about reproduction? But these are not reproductions. I don't know. What is an image? We've got a...
Maybe it's a kind of framing it instead as more kind of as an illusion or something that it alludes to. I think maybe the conversation at hand here is this idea of materiality is very present, but materiality at points contradicts what we are kind of experiencing as an illusion of the work. So when you get, as much as there's something that's kind of appearing, or even within this, there's some kind of form appearing, it kind of dissolves into a kind of surface that has a complexity that we can't really comprehend. And this is why it's so important to be here and to see it as a physical thing.
No, that's good. That's really good.
When you say that's not an image to you, is that just because it's 3-dimensional?
I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying my initial response is I don't think I would call that an image.
But
and then
would you call that an image?
Yeah, and then I'm kind of questioning myself about why is that my default sense. I think it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it, but I think my default thing is not.
When you said it, I was like, well, what makes this more of an image?
Yeah.
Because to me, talking about material, this is just as much sculptural as this, in a way.
Absolutely. I think this is definitely an object and has sculptural qualities. I don't know if that has image qualities. And then I'm wondering what I even mean by that sentence. But am I falling into a sort of thing of, it's a rectangle on a wall, so it's an image?
Let's not mince words here. Jack Whitten was an incredible material painter. He pushed at the boundaries constantly. These things, he was on the edge of something all the time. To come out of what was happening in New York in the 60s, where everything was about gesture, to then spring the abstract language of that into portraiture with his Black Monolith series, where he's making work about identity before that whole identity politic idea even exploded.
I think really we're talking about different languages. So we're talking about the language of sculpture and the language of painting and how it manifests the image. It's not detached from the image. They're both images. If you think about sculpture and how you can think about casting in sculpture, and these paintings are almost casted, but they're also, there's a threshold between sculpture and printmaking, having a background in printmaking myself, and this has got a lot of language of printmaking, and you think of things like the monotypes and monoprints, and his developer tool could be some sort of matrix as well. So it operates on so many different levels, and that's kind of part of the boundary pushing that you're talking about.
But we're looking at rectangles, aren't we? Which is kind of interesting. So there's all this pushing of boundaries, but then there's this extraordinarily conventional idea that everything's going to sit in a rectangle.
I think the most successful abexers were the ones who created what I would call, or what a lot of people call, all-over abstraction. The ones where the edges of the canvas don't feel like the edges of the work. That could continue forever, right? Like a really good Pollock. That could just continue, right? So he's like, he's hemmed himself into.
I don't think it matters.
These works like push outwards, and that's where their real strength lies.
Either.
This is why painting, when it's done on a rectangle or a given format, there's so much you can do.
But don't we want to get into subject? I mean, Jack Whitten is all about subject. So Jack Whitten stepped out of that, New York school, let's call it, and started to talk about subject, and like making his own room in art history, which is about blackness, about being an African-American painter, about subject, all of his Black Monolith series, even his early ghost paintings.
It could almost be like a photograph, like coming back to that idea of the image.
What was the phrase, sorry?
The one shot.
One shot.
So kind of like a monoprint, I guess, like a sort of setting up the conditions or the process to make an image or a thing, an object, kind of happen. I don't know. I just feel that phrase is very resonant. The one shot.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And he did do a series of works, didn't he, where he'd made a tool. Wasn't it? He made a tool that.
He made a massive squeegee, didn't he?
You could make a painting with
he would
one
make it
mark.
in one gesture.
The platform.
One gesture mark.
One gesture.
So is that the subject also?
I think those works, the one gesture works, I think that was him trying to divorce himself from the wider narrative of abstract painting. And what he really wanted to do was make work about identity and being a black historical artist. That's what I think. Yeah. And how he can carve his own space within art history using those tools.
I disagree. I think he puts consciousness before that. Yeah. Before identity. He's one of those types of black artists, if you like, a bit like Frank Bolin, that didn't necessarily want to be pigeonholed as a black artist and didn't want to operate in a vacuum as a black artist.
We've started sort of edging into this content question. What as an audience of other voices, what's your understanding of the content of this work?
I'm a first-time Jack person. I didn't know anything about him at all. I walked in here tonight, fresh eyes. I look at these paintings and I thought, actually, you're all too young to remember, but televisions used to look like that. When they broke down, they looked like that. And I thought, is that what he's doing? I didn't know he did these in the 70s. Is he just replicating what television looked like? So going back to your question, if there was a black and white television there that had gone wrong, which looks a bit like that, would that be an image?
It's such a brilliant observation. It is white noise. It is, and there's everything about. I even like the fact it's called white noise, and we've just touched on black and white issues around his identity, and then we're saying the paintings are like white noise. It's like, hang on, but they're also black noise, aren't they? Because they're talking about his identity as a black man. I think it'd be good to just throw in another kind of question, maybe. Josh, beforehand, you were sort of talking a little bit about, I think you were talking about the questions that these works ask of the viewer. And I wonder maybe if you could expand on that a little bit.
Can you see the activity of painting as a way of posing a question, and what kind of questions are being asked here.
So I'm looking at these and thinking, what I'm seeing is paintings that continue around the side of the stretcher. So they've been stretched afterwards. I think that's saying very clearly. So I'm curious as to what he was actually originally working on. Was it actually a big rectangle of canvas? Or was it paper? Or was it a slightly more less rectangular shape? And then I'm also asking the question, okay, who decided to hang this one horizontally, and who decided to hang that one vertically? And would those read differently? How would you see them? How would you be interpreting them the same way if they were hung both vertically? So that's a kind of question. And then I also picking up on your thinking, yes, these are interference lines of black and white TV, but I also have an IT computing background, so I'm seeing the kind of punched cards used for programming computers in the 1960s, which would have been something very influential in people's minds at the time. So I'm seeing slightly different influences there. So yeah.
You know, I think what you said is exactly that, and I'm wondering whether it's evident, this relationship between technology and handmade. And Jack was really, interested in technology and science, the most recent developments. And I think what he wanted was to anchor his paintings in the contemporary. And we see it now as well in painting. It's something that keeps on happening. And of course, sometimes, often 20 years later, a few decades later, well, of course, they won't feel contemporary anymore. So him working with technologies, digital, imagery technologies, but also scientific developments, that was really, as you say, cutting edge.
I think they would look less contemporary if they had a color on them, because I think colors are so tied into like certain eras that it would look more retro if it had like a more like 70s scheme.
I just wanted to go back to Josh's original question, which was, what are the paintings asking of the viewer? And for me, I think like it does go into quite a profound philosophical rhetoric straight away, in that it's sort of talking about existence, and the play with light and dark is like, it's for me, a very spiritual, almost a meditation. And maybe that's something to do with the way the patterns or the lines and then the disruptions in the lines come across. And there's also color play, so it's not specifically with that one, but with some of the other ones, if you go up close, they're black and white, but then from a distance you can see blues or yellows or purples. So I don't know, some sort of optic illusions are going on, which again kind of links back to the sort of spiritual philosophical thing, think about meditations and going into altered states. So I think they're definitely asking a lot of the viewer.
Whitten also talked about his studio as a laboratory, and that's something I thought would be interesting to unpick a little bit, about this very particular use of language around that, and maybe thinking, when we think of the word laboratory, what do we immediately associate that with? And I'm assuming we all immediately think of test tubes and things bubbling and sciencey experiments going on. So I think he would have made that association and yet wanted to talk about the studio as being that kind of space. So how does that differ from the idea of the studio as a studio? Why did he call the studio a laboratory?
Maybe going back to your question about whether they're contemporary, to me, that's part of what makes them feel contemporary. Is I think we're seeing this moment right now in which technology and art and conceptual thinking and emotional thinking are all sort of undifferentiating themselves, at least in some spaces. And
I think it's really great. It's really good because, well, I was just going to say, because I think one of the other things that's so interesting about it is that adoption of or interest in science and technology, but it's so resolutely about the hand as well, isn't it? There's nothing here that is actually given over to the machine. You know, there's a real relationship to it, but this is absolutely about the personal. Does anybody want to say anything about these small pieces?
I wonder the question about how contemporary do the works feel, if that applies to this, because someone mentioned the colors have a role to play in that.
We've been talking about painting, we've been talking about what's dated and what isn't. Can you see colour as a substance like painting? You know, rather than thinking whether it's dated or not, what currency does it have? We talked about, I mean, we're talking about black and white paintings as if black and white isn't a colour. You know, is that a colour or not? And as well, and how does it, what kind of substance does it have as a colour and language in the same way? Can you talk about that in the same way that you talk about painting?
So I'm also coming to this artist with fresh eyes, and all I'm seeing is like a retro reaction to the birth of the screen. Like all I'm like your point, the static TVs and stuff, and then these, like opposite to what you think, feel more contemporary because they've got colour, and like these look like photocopies. It's like it all fit apart except for this one, which feels, I don't know what that one's about.
Does that feel dated?
It does feel dated, but I think maybe it's the kind of aesthetic.
It's strange because although he was dealing with contemporary, very contemporary technology of his time, he kind of, because of that, he took it out of the contemporary and out of the time that he was living in, which is why I think they still feel contemporary now, and they will continue to feel relevant and recent, no matter where they are placed and when they are placed.
I was looking at that and thinking about how it seems so much more powerful than a television, because when I look at it, there's all these, every time I look at it, there's different shapes that kind of move around, and they don't just move around in simple lines, but they kind of bloom and blossom. And then after I looked at it, I looked at your face, and then you were kind of pixelated. And there were all these weird abstractions.
Thanks.
And I've never looked at a television and had something like that. So I think it kind of reminds you that painting can show you infinity and kind of life and endlessness. And televisions can only show you some pixels.
So I don't think he got to those with any interest in the screen whatsoever. He got to them because he was deeply devoted to his craft, and we all know that the best artists precede the time that they're in. They're like kind of orators or forward thinkers or whatever. That's what makes them incredible artists. So those paintings are ahead. Now we're thinking about the screen. Now we're thinking about the strafe. Now we're thinking about the iPhone, the iPad. He was making these decades before all of that.
Maybe these paintings show us that technology, its ultimate failing is it cannot produce the ineffable, and only life and nature can produce the ineffable, and only humans can make the ineffable, which is art.